So let me start with the first part, the aesthetics of talking dirty, 丑闻的美学, or the other title, 胡说八道, one of the two. Before turning to the second term, hearing, let me first turn to the concept of the first term, ugly. What is exactly that is overheard in so many of the notorious scenes of the novel that is so ugly? As I will argue in the next few minutes, by staging so many erotic scenes as overheard, the novel draws our attention to the idea that ugliness revolves around dirty words. In fact, I would argue that of the many corruptions found in the novel, Jinping crucially stages the perversion of language as one of the most fatal and fundamental roots of social chaos. A theme the novel most notably explores through Xi Jinping's delight in abusing this word, dada. Indeed, one of the reasons eavesdropping is so important in Jinping is because it shifts the reader's attention from the act of sex to the act of speech. When we take a careful look at the pornographic scenes of the novel, it is remarkable how much of these scenes revolves around perverted speech. Even when the sexual act is not portrayed as a scene overheard, one of the text's primary techniques of pornographic writing is still found in what the novel itself describes as the lascivious sounds and sexy words. Eavesdropping, in short, merely foregrounds a predilection in the novel that is found throughout its many pornographic scenes. That is, its literary delight in filling the mouths of its characters with dirty words. The importance of perverse language, or yinhua, in the novel has previously been noted by a variety of scholars. Yet, curiously enough, these scholars tend to remain silent on what the language actually consists of. For instance, as early as the late 17th century, Zhang Zhupo noted, and this is on handout number 2, in Jinping dirty language is used more often by Pan Jinlian and Wang Liu'er than by anyone else. The author has put into the mouths of Pan Jinlian and Wang Liu'er totally shameless and utterly unspeakable things, so intolerable that even Li Guijie and Zheng Aiyue could never have brought themselves to say them. By so doing, the author expresses his profound condemnation of Xi Jinping, who is really less than human, for when he is exposed to such bestiality, he actually expresses a preference for it. Even though Zhang Zhupo here clearly condemns the notion of dirty language, he does not tell us what this language actually consists of. Similarly, and more recently, Ding Naifei has drawn our attention to the way Zhang Zhupo's aversion to dirty language and his tendency to ascribe such speech to women betrays the 17th century commentator's misogynist's nature. Yet, despite her undeniably brilliant reading, like the 17th century critic Zhang Zhupo, Ding remains remarkably reticent on one crucial question. What exactly is said that makes the language of Jinping so dirty to begin with? To answer this question, let me turn to one particularly notorious chapter, chapter 27, and you probably know this chapter because of the second grape arbor scene. But as you may well know, the seed for the notorious second half of this chapter is already sown in the first half of the chapter. There, Xi Jinping, during a bout of passionate lovemaking with his concubine Li Ping'er, learns that he is about to become a father, all the while being overheard by his concubine and Li Ping'er's rival, Pan Jinlian. What makes this particular scene scandalous? Not the fact that Xi Jinping is about to become a father. This, at least for Xi Jinping, is a happy event which potentially represents the continuation of his surname and patrilineal descent. Neither, I would argue, is it the fact that Xi Jinping is having sex with Li Ping'er. She is, after all, Xi Jinping's concubine, and the act is, at least for appearance's sake, completely legitimate. Rather, what makes the scene perverse is the way it combines these two elements, the fact that Xi Jinping is having sex while his wife is pregnant, thereby combining two crucial and potentially conflicting functions of sex. That is, sex as pleasure and sex as procreation. It is precisely Xi Jinping's overindulgence in sex as a pleasurable form that precludes him from ever achieving really its fruition in its procreative form. Seduced and deluded by, amongst others, Pan Jinlian, Xi Jinping himself ends up dying from overspending his sexual energy. And this is a beautiful scene you should definitely read at some point that involves a mushroom that explodes. That's his penis, and it's nice. Meanwhile, he indulges Pan Jinlian to such a degree that she is capable of killing his as yet unborn son, Guangge. Indeed, when together with Pan Jinlian we carefully listen to the way Li Ping'er delivers the news of her pregnancy, we can already hear the faint echoes of the way Xi Menqing's indulgence in sex will eventually lead to not life but death, and this is handout number 3. After a while, Pan Jinlian heard Li Ping'er say in a low voice, "My own daddy, don't bang away at me quite so hard. I'm feeling poorly in my present condition. You were a little bit too rough with me the last time and left me with a pain in the abdomen that has only begun to get better in the last few days." Here, Li Ping'er's physical discomfort caused by pregnancy and Xi Menqing's rough handling of her seems to lead to a happy conclusion. Xi Menqing learns he's going to be a daddy and, quote, ejaculates like a geyser, end quote. Not many chapters later, however, we will hear echoes of this first encounter as Li Ping'er once again complains to her husband that he is hurting her belly during sex, end quote. "Daddy, slow down a bit, you're thrusting so hard it really hurts inside," end quote. That time, the act will directly lead to her death. As doctors explain on Li Ping'er's deathbed, her death is caused by having sex inappropriately, engaging in rough intercourse soon after childbirth and in the midst of her menstrual period. If the scene in chapter 27 in and of itself is perverse because of the way it blurs the boundaries between two crucial functions of sex, the act of overhearing extends this perversion to the realm of language itself. This linguistic perversion is already hinted at in the chapter title. Li Ping'er 私语 非词学. There the single term 私语, i.e. private language, nicely combines the notions of secret spoken, which is one of its meanings, with sounds of lovemaking, which is another one of its meanings, thus cleverly sullying what should have been a happy tiding, the news of the birth of a son, with the secrecy of sexual pleasures, the panting and puffing and the soft cooing of the oriole, titillating the ears of the eavesdropping Pan Jinlian to such a degree that, as the novel writes, quote, "she might well have ejaculated, is it not delightful?" And that's a quote from the Confucian classics that is used rather perversely here, of course. Most notably, however, this use of dirty language is found in a term that in any other context would not be all that dirty, namely dada. Indeed, at best, the use of dada bespeaks the way in which sexuality in late imperial China reinforced patrilineal power, both in its pleasurable and its procreative form. In the case of the scene described above, for instance, Xi Menqing's delight in having Li Ping'er address him as her daddy seems merely mildly ironic. After all, the man is about to learn he will become a father. Similarly, when Xi Menqing has, for once, sex with his only legitimate wife, Wu Yuanyang, and in a whispered voice asks him to call him daddy, this gentle insistence on being called dada can still be perceived as touchingly needy. And that, I think, is Andrew Plax's reading of that particular scene. And he also appreciates Li Ping'er's lovemaking scene as one of the touching moments of tender lovemaking between husband and wife. Yet given Xi Menqing's increasingly perverse insistence that all his lovers call him daddy, it gradually becomes clear that by employing the word so repeatedly, the novel is hinting at something rotten at the heart of Xi Menqing's linguistic enactment of his ever-expanding patriarchal power. For instance, the first dirty words we, through the ears of the eavesdropping monks, hear Pan Jinlian say to her lover in chapter 8 are not surprisingly, "Daddy." And this is handout number 4. "Daddy, how long will you just keep banging? I'm afraid the monks will hear. So have mercy on your slave and come quickly." It's much better in Chinese, really. 打打你之故，打到几时? I love that. How long do you keep on? Anyways. 只怕和尚来听见，饶了奴，快些丢了吧. Indeed, when Xi Menqing insists on being called daddy by women whose daddy he definitely should not be, the perverse pleasure he takes from the term becomes ever more apparent. When Xi Menqing, for instance, takes possession of one of his servants' wives, Zhang Si, he not only burns moxa on her body to mark her as his property, he also insists on a lengthy verbal exchange in which inappropriate terms of address are central to the pleasures of Xi Menqing, and this is handout number 5. The woman frowned her face and gnashed her teeth, bearing the pain, and she spoke softly from her mouth with a quivering voice, moaning chaotically, calling out repeatedly, "Daddy, Papa, let me be. It is insufferable." Xi Menqing called out, "Zhang Si, you slut, whose wife are you?" The woman said, "I am my daddy's wife." Simon Cheng told her, "Say that you used to be Xiong Wang's wife, but that today you belong to your own sweet daddy." The woman echoed, "I used to be Xiong Wang's wife, but today I belong to my own sweet daddy." End quote. Undoubtedly, the perversity of the scene is based in part on the detailed and graphic description of the sexual act, which includes the cruel insistence on torturing the woman by placing burning incense on her body. Yet it is no coincidence that this punishing routine ends not in a description of sex, but rather in a transcription of dialogue. As if mocking Simon Ching's role as a corrupt magistrate, this scene slowly turns into a forced and false confession. Simon Ching is punishing his illegitimate lover till she proclaims that, "Today I belong to my own sweet daddy." As I already mentioned above, this misuse of the term daddy should be understood in terms of the orthodox Confucian principle of dongming, or rectification of names. In more philosophical and historical-minded texts, this notion is called upon when, in a clear abuse of titles, dukes begin to call themselves kings. In a pornographic novel such as Jinping Mei, however, the fear of luanming, or abuse of names, instead takes the form of more intimate terms of address. The effect, however, I would argue is the same. The abuse of the term daddy represents for the reader a clear descent into chaos, something that becomes particularly explicit when it raises the specter of incest, or luanlun. As both Andrew Plax and Tina Liu have made clear, Jinping Mei consistently flirts with ideas of incest, either as the logical yet perverse extension of Neo-Confucian self-cultivation, or as the inevitable result of a self-enclosed worldview where somehow everyone is always already related. What the misuse of the term daddy makes clear is that this perversion is also enacted on the most basic linguistic level. When we read, for instance, that Simon Ching is called daddy by the courtesan Li Guijie after she has been adopted by his first wife, the use of the term fully gives voice to the ghost of incest that haunts the novel. After all, at this point, her excitable cries of passion, "Daddy, finish off as quickly as you can, I'm afraid that someone will come along," are horrifically literal. Simon Ching is here, from a technical point of view at least, having relations with his own adopted daughter. Let me skip quite a bit here. That sort of summarizes and brings us back to the main theme. Let me quickly talk about the oral architecture of the novel and see how much I can do of that before we enter into questions. As I mentioned earlier, what I mean by the oral architecture of the novel is the way gossip, overhearing, hearsay, rumors connect all the different events in the novel. And I've given an example of that at the beginning of this talk, how that works, how a single moment of overhearing can be spread through gossip to engulf more and more people, more and more spaces, more and more events. What is important for this particular novel, I think, is that it also works the other way around, that gossip can bring in events that happened 20 chapters earlier or 70 chapters later, that by talking about someone, you can introduce that character even before the reader has read them. And you can actually introduce a character 5 or 6 times before he actually is put on stage. And this way of, in a centripetal way, bringing all of the events, characters, and plot events of the novel together in some sort of structure is crucial, I argue, for the kind of novel that Jinping Mei is, which is a sprawling text, 100 chapters with God knows how many characters. If you've ever seen the David Roy translation, I think the first 30 pages or so are just summaries of names and who is who and who does what to whom, etc. Moreover, it spreads like gossip as well. As a scandalous novel, the novel doesn't just end with the final lines, thus Pan Jinglian met her horrible deserved fate, and her remaining stink, or her lingering stink, became the talk for 1,000 more years. That is literally what happens. At the end of the novel, that's how the novel ends. But after that, everybody picks up the novel and starts gossiping about this novel, and starts being spread around society and to all kinds of levels of society that basically you see in the novel as well as being interconnected through gossip. Now, this previously has been discussed by Shang Wei, the way the novel not so much is gossiped about, but the way the novel brings in different texts and different events and creates a texture of everyday life that is incredibly detailed and incredibly variegated in the way it draws on so many different sources. So there I'm drawing on him. What I'm arguing, however, is that this is not some sort of, sometimes it's almost read as a post-structuralist delight of quotations that the reader should enjoy and celebrate. Instead, what I'm arguing is that this is actually a tremendous anxiety-provoking fear that text is now everywhere. And there's so much text that the legitimate voices of the literati are being drowned out by all of this chatter in society. What the novel does, in my view, is by talking about gossip and including so much gossip and 闲话, or idle chatter, it not only gives you all of these tidbits of information, it not only connects all of these tidbits of information, it also provides you a mechanism to read past sort of the surface of all of this gossip and start reconnecting it and seeing the pattern that lies behind it. It's a particular aesthetics of reading that really literally enacts what I think is the proper term for novel, 小说, right? Small talk. That is really what the novel does. And I have a couple of examples of ways in which gossip spreads and in which gossip connects different places. And maybe I can jump briefly through some of these. This is a very good scene in chapter 15 where the Lantern Festival is being enjoyed by the wives of Xi Menqing, who you here see on the second floor, while down below, and unfortunately I don't have this on the handout, down below commoners start gossiping about who these women might be. And they say, well, these must be women from the imperial household because they're wearing imperial household clothing. No, they must be courtesans. No, they must belong to the aristocracy. And finally somebody comes by and says, well, you don't know who this is, but I know who this really is. I don't know who the person on the left is, but the person on the right is Pan Jinlian, and she was married to Wu Da, and she killed her husband, and Xi Menqing killed her husband, and then Wu Song, the brother of Wu Da, and then you get all of this gossip about what happened 10 chapters earlier, and meanwhile you're also reminded that Wu Da, right? Wu Song, the older brother of the man murdered, 70 chapters later will appear as a vengeful man and kill Pan Jinlian in turn. So in this kind of gossipy chatter here spoken by commoners on the street, you sort of get various moments of the novel thrown together, reminding you both of what has happened before and what happens later. And meanwhile, by carefully listening to that gossip, for instance, by noting that somebody says, well, they must belong to the imperial family, you're sort of reminded of yet another theme of the novel, namely that Xi Menqing is constantly appropriating all kinds of symbols of power, such as the word father when he should not, or clothing that he should not have, etc., 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 right? So that is one example of gossip. An even more celebrated novel moment of gossip is when Jin Lian starts overhearing a conversation that takes place here within this grotto between her husband, Xi Menqing, and her rival, Song Huilian. And as she overhears this, what is interesting here is that whatever is heard inside, you don't just hear as a reader, you also hear Pan Jinlian reflecting on everything that is being said within the grotto, within her own mind. So overhearing here starts opening up a space, an interior space, not only in terms of literal space, i.e. the other side of the door on the inside of this grotto or the other side of this window. It starts opening up a window into the interiority of people's minds that is being opened up. And this is, of course, how you can truly prove that somebody is a really dirty down a slut of a woman, such as Jin Lian or something like that, right? Because now you can hear into her soul directly. So that's another interesting moment. A third moment that I think is important, so you have interiority of space, you have interiority of character, if you will, is that plot moments get connected from within the novel itself. There's no deus ex machina in Jinping Mei. It's more a case that rumor and gossip finally end up bringing whatever you've done back to you as the gossip spreads, and you will meet your just rewards. So in chapter 99, there's this beautiful moment where Zhang Sheng, a not too important character, ends up killing this son-in-law, Chen Jingji, after he has heard how Chen Jingji is plotting to kill him. And the reason Zhang Sheng can overhear Chen Jingji, and the reason why Chen Jingji himself has no clue that somebody's overhearing him is because Chen Jingji is too distracted making love. So they're making a lot of noise and racket on the inside of this room, and meanwhile fail to notice that outside somebody's overhearing him. This man then gets so upset that he takes out his knife and kills the man. So if you're not careful and you let yourself be distracted by sex, you will end up being dead, basically. So overhearing and rumor function to connect all of these different aspects of what I call an oral architecture. An oral architecture that consists of, again, space, characters, and plot events that are all tied in seamlessly into one very strong narrative architecture that sort of manages to bring all of these disparate elements and characters and events in the novel together within one single structure. I probably should stop here. So I'll leave it at that. There's some stuff about sequels that fret about why and how this novel spreads and how we shouldn't do it. And then they start gossiping themselves, of course. They decry all of the gossip in the novel, and then they start gossiping. Do you know who the author is? I think I know who the author is. I've heard, etc., 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 etc. But I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much. Are there any?
Go ahead and take the questions yourself.
Gentleman with a red shirt, I think. That would be you. Sorry, I don't know names. So.
The novel's usually expurgated now. I don't know what it was historically. Does that ruin the novel?
Oh yes. You would not get quotes about "Daddy, please finish off quickly," stuff like that. Or my favorite quote is when Pan Jinglian cries out excitedly, "My big dick daddy," or something like that. "Da ji ba da da." You know, which really brings filthy language and the notion of father together in a similar, same space, if you will. All of that stuff is cut in a lot of novels, and as a result, it's very hard, or they're translated. If they're translated into Latin, you know, because then gentlemen readers can partake of this pornography without having their minds sullied, if you will, right? It's not for the lower classes who cannot speak Latin. In mainland China, all of this stuff is still pretty much being expurgated. And you can read amazingly good studies of Jinping made that really go into the linguistic detail of all of the language, because it's a very variegated and rich novel in terms of its use of vulgar language and vernacularisms, etc. So there's a lot of studies on that, and then at the end of it they say, we still feel that about 33% of the novel can be cut without impunity or something like that. Obviously everybody just goes online and reads it there, but
they even have put just the dirty bits, so that you can buy the expurgated edition and then look online, and then you've got all the dirty bits, page by page.
Amazing. I just go through the text and put in a search word like dada, and then find out, oh, it's used 79 times in the entire novel, it's used 13 times in this chapter, etc. But thank you for that helpful hint.
Busy people out there.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I haven't read the novel, but I was just wondering a couple of things about it. With the use of hearsay and gossip and whatnot, was this novel, or is it considered revolutionary in China as far as literature goes, advancing the plot as far and continuity and whatnot?
Yes.
And the second question, very quickly, have they attempted to make any movie or plays of this today? I mean, not back when Mao was running. Have they attempted to make any theater play or movie of this novel? Either in whole or in part?
Two questions. First question was, sorry, I'm not much. Yes, I would say it's the first novel that is really set in the interior space of a family, and that goes for 100 chapters long about the interior, really, of this one family. So if I were to go through all of the 100 illustrations or 200 illustrations that go with the novel, most of these will show you some sort of domestic setting. If you compare this to the novel on which this novel is based, right? This novel is built on the carcass of another novel, Shui Hu Zhuan, Outlaws of the Marsh, right? There you have a couple of chapters that deal with the hero, Wu Song. He fights a tiger and comes down from the mountain, meets his brother who he has not seen for a long time. His brother is murdered by Pan Jinglian, and then, you know, he takes revenge and kills Pan Jinglian. All of that ends in a couple of chapters. Jinping Mei takes that those couple of chapters and blows it up to 100 chapters. And in doing so, it completely changes the structure of the novel and the setting of the novel, where the Shui Hu Duan, or the Outlaws of the Marsh, is set in the margins of society, outside amidst what is called Jianghu, rivers and lakes, and the heroes are marginal creatures as well themselves. They're outlaws, they're bandits. Jinping Mei draws all of this towards the interior and towards a domestic setting and turns it into this huge squabbling between different wives, etc. So gossip works very well for that kind of domestic setting. You can overhear, from one room to another, and that happens constantly in this novel, that some people are shouting loudly either because they're having sex and don't want to be overheard, or precisely because they do want to be overheard, and then the news travels. That's very different in earlier novels, and in particular, the novel on which this novel is based, Outlaws of the Marsh, which is all about exteriority, male heroism, not female conniving and gossip, etc. So that's really, it's a revolutionary novel in that sense. And as to plays and film, yes, is the brief answer. What I find interesting about the novel is that pornography, I think, in a way, does not make for nice either family talk or social occasion, social gatherings of sorts. Pornography, I think of pornography as something, especially now with the internet, as something that you do by yourself alone. And I think the novel is like that as well. And the novel is the kind of text that allows for private reading, creates a private self, and pornography really calls for a private self in many ways. And that's why, for instance, 17th, 18th century commentators say you should never read this alone. This is a public text, precisely because they're afraid that it will get abused in that sort of private sense. It needs to be an open public text, right? But partially because of that, at least in pre-modern China, sort of performative kinds of rewritings are rare. There are some, but it's not the kind of thing that you, if you think of opera as partially a ritual kinds of performative occurrence as well, you're not gonna, perform pornography at the 60th birthday remembrance of your grandmother kind of thing, right? So as opera, it's not that much used. There's a couple of what are called 子弟书, 19th century bannerman texts that sort of stand in between performance and text, if you will, that sort of perform this novel as rewrites.
Is this really pornographic?
No, those later texts that I've seen, the 子弟书, are not pornographic, and those are expurgated as well. So you're going to have to go to the handwritten or better editions of those particular drum ballad songs by Bannerman in order to get a sense of what they're like. And then in the 20th century, obviously, there's lots of films, and one of the things that happens with notoriety or gossip is that people start calling things Jinping Mei even if it has nothing to do with it, right? Because it sells. I mean, that's one way in which a scandalous tale as this keeps spreading. You just take the title and, Jinping Mei 2, and Jinping Mei 3. So if you see there's relatively good cinematic versions of this, but a lot of it is, made up stuff as well. Yes.
It seems interesting also to think about sort of interiority of reading, novel reading in relationship to domestic architecture, right? Because what is interesting about the novel is that on the one hand, the reading itself presumes, as you say, a private self, private individual in an enclosed space. But the novel actually uses the permeability of domestic architecture in imperial times, right? Where, I guess, there are open windows and, I guess, opaque windows, gates, walls that screen people from view, and so on. In that respect, it seems very different from 19th century European novels, right, where interiority had a very different valence of people actually created these impermeable domestic spaces.
Yes, definitely. I don't know if that is a question or an observation. Two things. I like that idea of thinking of reading as more permeable, and I think if you take as a model the Western novel, which is highly associated with individualism and private self, etc., it is clear that the Chinese quote-unquote novel, if that is the equivalent of what we have, is a much more sociable object, if you will, right? And you see this in the early recensions of people talking about the novel, that this is a novel that is being passed on. It's not necessarily read in permeable spaces, but it is passed on from hand to hand, from one person to another. They write commentaries to it. So when I talk about the 17th century commentary writer, obviously these are commentaries that are written in the text itself and published as such. So it's a much more imaginatively, at least, social object than the Western novel would be. And you're right, the architecture of 17th century China, if only because you need huge windows for light. I've never figured out how that works, but obviously once we get gaslight and all that kind of stuff in the 19th century, you can start reading late at night, and you can read indoors, and you can read without a huge window, etc. Before that, and you can print obviously much smaller. Jinping is a huge text with lots of characters. Try reading that, with a flashlight under your cover, right? You can't do that. So there is a certain kind of openness to that. The only thing I would say is that I don't know enough about libraries, but what I've read about libraries of gentlemen, they tend to be pretty well guarded, right? And we have all of these anecdotes about people at least guarding their favorite expensive books with all kinds of things. They dig moats around it, and if you read these famous descriptions of famous libraries, people are denied access to it. Only sons, for instance, and sometimes even sons cannot come in there. But yes, you're right. Privacy itself also obviously means something else completely in this time. Some people have said that privacy doesn't exist because either you're too poor to have a room for yourself, or you're so rich that you constantly have a maid or a servant, with you. So what does it mean to be private if you have, your young boy servant hand you the next scroll of Jinping Mei, right? Is that then a non-person? Are you alone? So yes, you're right. It's the whole idea of privacy is very much being questioned in that. Yes.
Is this technique of gossip used in a political way in novels today to discuss the leadership?
Yes. It's something I didn't get to in part, but just as I argue that the abuse of names, so calling yourself daddy or something like that, or having other people call you daddy, has a political aspect to it. It's really the patriarch, or it's the emperor, right? Taking on a persona that doesn't really belong to you. That has huge political ramifications, and that idea of Zhengming is really something that is tied more to politics than anything else. So does gossip in the novel have huge political ramifications. The novel is all about, as people have argued, interiority. And you can imagine this interiority leaking to a variety of spaces. But as people have pointed out, this interiority is always read allegorically as the empire itself. Just as Simon Qing is the father of the household, so does he stand for, in a way, the father of the exteriority, the emperor of the Chinese empire. So this notion of gossip does two things, I think. First, simply borrowing. There's lots of anecdotes in the ancient histories, the Shiji, etc., of rumors, gossip, political intrigue within the bedrooms of the emperor, of his favorite concubines sort of usurping power, or eunuchs usurping power from the emperor, and gossip constantly circulating, and that kind of gossip undermining the emperor. And then the other way this works is that because you constantly have this gossip allowing interiority to be leaked outside, that chain eventually leads in a way to the highest echelons of power, if you will. And Hong Lo Meng, which is a completely different novel but closely related, Dream of the Red Chamber to Jinping Mei, does that even more strongly, right? There's all kinds of stuff going on in that household until finally, through gossip and God knows what, the emperor gets wind of all of this and cracks down. So the link between private household, or the microcosm of private household, and the macrocosm of the empire is always there in the back of the reader's mind, and it can be explicitly linked through chains of rumor. Is that a question or is that a
I would be tempted to tie many of the parts together to power relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so Xi-Ching is the kind of guy who thinks he can go off to the license quarters with a kind of a hood over him and nobody will know who he is.
Right.
And so he presents himself as an upstanding citizen, and then that's predicated on the idea that what he actually does is not known.
Right.
Within the household, the person who makes it almost her job to find out what he's up to is Panjinlian.
Right.
And so there's a kind of contest of power between the two of them. And so she's the prime eavesdropper, and then she immediately makes use of the material that she gets. And so when Xi-Ching calls himself Dada, he is equating also sex with power.
Mm-hmm.
Panjinlian, on the other hand, will call herself vis-a-vis Xi-Ching as your mother, Wei Niang, and it's the same kind of power business. She doesn't use it sexually, right? But it seems to be largely more a question of power. Who is controlling this information that's seeking out?
Yes.
And so often the novelist says, if you don't want people to know, don't do it.
Right.
And the novel kind of shows that it's going to come out.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely about power relationships, and I think you need to read that in two ways. The first is that, yes, people who possess this information have power. And Xi-Ching, you can see, gathers information as well. There's this other character, Ying Bojue, who's this eternal gossip and knows everything about everything, basically. He's constantly called upon to talk to Xi-Ching, and then he will tell him again, have you heard that there's, at this moment, for sale, very cheaply, imperial wood or something like that has been salvaged, etc. He constantly brings in these tidbits of knowledge, and he becomes this conduit of power, if you will, that consists of information, of knowing what is going on where, etc. Similarly, when Xi-Ching, I didn't show that, maybe I can. This illustration is nice. Xi-Ching obviously is so corrupt that eventually somebody gets wind of it. And sends an impeachment to the capital. Xi-Ching then obviously gets wind of that, and before the impeachment is even sent, has sent his own messengers to the capital to intercept it. And this particular illustration is nice in that sense that you see on the top part 2 messengers of Xi-Ching returning from the capital after they've bribed everybody, whereas on the bottom, the official imperial messengers are still on their way to the capital to impeach Xi-Ching. So. Power and knowledge, and who owns power and who gets to news first, and how is that leaked or is it not leaked, right? Because he reads the Imperial Gazette and then unofficially copies it or gets wind of it. All of that is restricted officially, but he somehow gets wind of it anyways. All of that is very important in the novel. The one thing that I would warn against, and this is not something you said, but the way gossip is often talked about by people, is that it is this empowering mechanism of the powerless. Right, that it is, well, take whatever you will. But you have courtesans sitting around. There's a beautiful scene of courtesans sitting around, gossiping about their male patrons, and this is how they empower themselves, etc. That may very well be true, or one way of reading it. But I would say that at least the novel, being a very orthodox-minded novel, does not see gossip as an empowering mechanism, or not as a positively empowering mechanism. If Panjinlian, if Panjinlian owns gossip, if Ying Bojue trades in gossip, that is a bad thing. There should be official, above-board communications that certain people should have access to, but not this leaking of whispers. That is something that is seen as intrigue and negative as a result. Yes.
Follow up on that comment. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the contemporary context of discussion about gossip and the way that it's portrayed in other kinds of popular writings, official writings, as a social phenomenon, and also the extent to which that is new, what is specifically contemporary about the current discourse on gossip.
Thank you. This is the beginning of Project 2, so I'm treading here lightly on what I know and don't know, and it's very easy to overgeneralize on a little bit that, and then make huge claims about. This is what you probably know after teaching Chinese literature for a while. This has never happened before in Chinese literature, and then 2 days later you find that 2,000 years earlier people were doing exactly the same thing, and then you start wondering, what is new exactly? One of the things that I'm looking at, for instance, are operas, and operas as a form of spreading news, or spreading. And an opera, unlike a novel, obviously, which especially a 100-chapter novel such as G.P. May, which is hard to produce, takes time, years to write, then publish, print, illustrate, etc. Opera, if you have the right technique, is something that can be relatively easily improvised, and all kinds of tidbits of knowledge can be thrown in. So one of the things that I'm looking at is opera, and how opera as a performance spreads rumor and gossip as well. And then, of course, again, how in opera itself this becomes a theme. And what I'm hoping to do there is look more at the political implications of political opinion or public opinion being marshaled through things such as opera. So there are operas, most notably somebody named Li Yu, 17th century. He's not the same as Li Yu, also 17th century famous person. This is a lesser-known Suzhou playwright who some years after some men in Suzhou were executed, restages all of this, and then the uprising that came out of it, because there was a huge uprising by people, and this uprising was fueled by gossip. It was people hearing that one of their local Suzhou people had been arrested and would be transported to the capital, potentially for execution, and when the populace gets wind of that, it starts spreading like wildfire all throughout the streets, and they show up at the official yamen, and people get killed, right, in protest against it. And this play then plays into this, and really stages on stage and off stage this spreading of rumor, and how you get more and more characters on stage as a result. So you have these beautiful scenes of, it almost reads like revolutionary opera. You have these beautiful scenes of peasants, and, well, not soldiers, but still artisans, right? So we have two, Gungnung, showing up on stage and shouting, "We're going to burn down the temple," etc., or whatever, because they've heard all of these rumors. And it becomes this violent scene. And never do we get a name or whatever. It really represents public opinion and a mass of bodies in society brought together by the power of gossip, if you will. And I think that is very 17th century, and you see that a lot. You see a lot of people talking about opera or other tracts being spread throughout society, and sort of starting to marshal these spontaneous outbursts of violence, and also people making use of that somebody sometimes is involved in spreading those gossips quite maliciously, knowing that things will turn bad. So there's a lot of people whose houses get burned down because of these spontaneous riots of gossip spreading. And I think, can't judge earlier, but that strikes me as something very 17th century. And definitely the novel as a very complex vernacular form that somehow needs to connect all of these tidbits, etc., that is very late to me.
Maybe we need a break for a second so people can run off to classes if they need to be. So let's thank Paize once, this time.
Thank you.
Those who need to go, please go. And Paize, if you're willing to take some questions.
Sure, I'll be happy to stick around. Yes.
Two quick things. One, I didn't get, what was the expression you used a couple of times, acoustic what? Obscenity, acoustic, at the beginning of your talk, acoustic.
Architecture? Is that the one that I used?
This is a test of your own talk.
Clearly I failed.
The other quick thing, I was reminded of partial overlapping with, maybe you know the article by Mac Horton on the role of maids and others in the Genji.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice neat thing in the book for teaching, approaches to teaching Genji. But the whole business of gossip, sprawling novel,
Yes.
and God knows you have interiority on interiority in Genji. And
Right.
people wonder, thinking, what are other